Hello, I'm Justin with 934 Gallery, and today I'm joined by our March artists with the exhibition Windows. Um, Shree, if you could introduce yourself for me.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Sri Kodakalla. I am an artist based in Charlottesville, Virginia. I create a mix of fiber and printmaking works that are usually start small scale collage and extend to larger tapestry style works.
Thank you.
Sorry. Hi, I'm Maddie Rhondeau-Rhodes. I'm also from Charlottesville. I actually typically do large format paintings that are based off of kind of surrealist collages. So for me, this exhibition was a little bit of a departure from what I normally do.
Hi everyone, I'm Brielle DuFlon. I am also based in Charlottesville with these two, and my medium is I've kind of settled on calling my medium texture. I work in mixed media, but um, I've, I'm always drawn to creating some kind of relief in my work. Recently, sort of spurred on by this show, a lot of my work has started to be made out of paper, which is really exciting. But I've used a myriad of other materials before, and I'm very excited to continue on this path. So.
And then, if you could give us a slight introduction to the exhibition Windows itself. And if you could kind of start with, I noticed in the artist statement and on the vinyl wall that we created for you guys, you put the longitude and latitude of different areas. Could you go into that for me?
Yeah, absolutely. So for this show, we came together. There were a couple different things at play that we had in mind for this show. One of them was we wanted to sort of speak to each other's homes and to our own homes, and home sort of being a complicated concept, but the idea of like where we were born or what the culture that has sort of shaped us, whether that's familial or where we've kind of landed. So we all share Charlottesville in common. And then we have three different places that we sort of originated from or have come from. Um, Maddie was born closer to Charlottesville in the Crozet area, and Sri was born in India, in New Delhi. And I was born in the States but moved to Guatemala when I was really young. So we had these three countries of the US, India, and Guatemala to kind of play with. And what we ended up the way that we ended up sort of trying to tie this together was through our choice in materials. And we landed on all using these three books. So each of us used three books. And one of the books that we each had spoke to the place that each of us was from. So we each chose a book. I chose a book that was about Guatemalan textiles. Sri chose a book that was sort of streets photography scenes of India. And Maddie chose a book about Virginia's architecture. And all three of us used all three books to incorporate them into these pieces. So they ended up being a really neat sort of everybody had their own interpretation of the materials to speak to topics like I mean, some of our themes were sort of ideas on home, belonging, identity, being a visitor or an alien in a space, welcoming and welcome. I don't know, lineage. There was a lot in there that we all kind of spoke to in different ways, or almost took this show to kind of speak about what we each wanted to speak about in that sense.
And then was the name Windows something that you decided on together? Did one of you pick that out and say it was a good fit for what you were trying to do?
Yeah, we settled on it together. I think because, and feel free to pipe in if you guys want, but when we were at the beginning, we were talking about how a lot through especially um, our different modes of kind of expressing these interior or how we see the exterior world. We wanted to invite people into kind of our world, whether that's inside of us or how we kind of are the lens we see through. And especially with some of the surrealism that Maddie plays with and my sort of abstract texturescapes, um, and Sri is sort of in the middle. There's a magical kind of realism in her work, but also some abstraction. And it just felt like a it felt like each of the pieces was a window into a world or into a way of being in the world that maybe isn't your like natural way of being. So it kind of we wanted to open people up to new perspectives and inhabiting those.
Yeah, absolutely. I just wanted to throw in that I also remember us thinking about this idea of like windows being like gateways or like portals to seeing like you were saying with using the word like perspectives or lenses of looking in and looking out. And I really love this idea of like portals to a world that's kind of within ourselves that people get this brief moment to look into.
I'll just jump in and say too, like I think that the medium of collage has a really transformative um, kind of angle to it. You can create landscapes or interior scapes that wouldn't otherwise exist, and you can even create, you know, figures that are representative or abstract to kind of inhabit those spaces too. And so I think when we were thinking of how to tie kind of all of our own personal interests together, that collage was really kind of um, the best kind of mode of transportation to go with this exhibition.
Now, Shri, could you give me a little bit of background on your kind of evolution as an artist to coming to this point, to this show? And then I'll ask both Bree and Maddie to kind of touch on that as well, because you had mentioned that there might be some skills that you needed to develop or some ways that you looked at art that changed to kind of put the show together.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like I did find this, like in developing work for this show, to be a challenge. I actually, so my art, like my art career has been kind of short lived, but one that feels like has launched off pretty quickly in the way that I've kind of moved toward creating professional art and seeking showcasing in exhibitions and kind of like learn. I feel like I started learning about the art world in such a like fast trajectory way that only started about like 4 or 5 years ago. And I kind of, when I first came into the like creating art professionally, I started with like a residency program at McGuffey Art Center that both Brielle and Maddie actually had gone through in previous years. And part of our connection to each other is also tied to the place where we met each other, which is this community art center that provided studio spaces for us. And that residency program was kind of like my first time having access to like disciplined art space to work and create. And I kind of initially came in as someone who was doing drawing and painting and had zero mixed media, any like I had never created textural works. I had never um, seen any of the other skill sets that I had as I'd seen them more as craft and less as fine art. And so I had had this really strong sewing background because I actually did costume tech and costume design through theater for years prior. And I'd never used it in art because I didn't see the link between the two until I actually had disciplined time and space to create work. And in the past, maybe 2 or 3 years, I started exploring sewing and incorporating kind of like figurative and abstract works and in the same entity, whether that was like through collage works where I'd sew on top of the pieces to as ways to bind them together, or now, which I've moved toward trying to figure out how to bring back my love of painting and drawing, which was where I first came into art, and then also kind of like tie in this new space that I'm in, which is focused on finding materials that I feel tied to. So a lot of my relationship with doing with incorporating sewing in my tapestry works is tied to being very specific about or intentional about the materials I use.
Maybe Maddie, you could jump in next.
Yeah. So, I mean, I've always kind of been had this kind of high intensity about art, like even as a kid, I was constantly making work. When I got into undergrad, I didn't start out doing art. I was convinced I was going to be saving old buildings and going into architecture. And then because I was super type A, I finished my degree early and I was like, well, I still have more time here. I guess I could explore doing art. And so I did get another degree in studio art, although I wasn't as focused on painting as I was. And the painting that I was doing was like very abstract, like drip paintings,
Okay.
like really large format drip paintings. And then when I got out of college, I had a series of very high intensity jobs where I was doing art on the side, but I really wasn't committing a ton of time to doing that. And as Sri mentioned, that residency program through McGuffey, I applied for, got in, and that gave me dedicated time to kind of allow myself to sift through some of the ideas I had had for a long time and apply them. I feel like I was telling the girls earlier, my art style has changed a lot in the last 4 years, almost to the point where it's a little embarrassing because I get really excited about things and then I'll kind of switch between um, like more kind of abstract styles to more, I guess it's more representational now. But I think consistently when I've shown at galleries, there's always kind of like a dark alternative bent to the galleries that I've exhibited with. So honestly, 934 is a very different gallery than I've exhibited with, just because I feel like the work that I have made for this show is maybe more. It's kind of, it leans less into that dark surrealism side and more into maybe just kind of um, surrealism and representational and all of that good stuff. So for this exhibition, it was really challenging for me to work with like textiles, like from Brielle's book, because I tend to lean more towards like, if I want to put a bird in there, I'm going to find a real bird,
Hmm.
instead of like making the shadow of a bird out of, textiles that I found in a pattern and, like some kind of garment or something. So,
Well, we all appreciate you stretching your
yeah,
artistic capabilities for us.
thanks.
Bree, if you could hop in.
We really do all appreciate it, Maddie. um, yeah, so my path's been a little bit meandering with art. I grew up with two artist parents, so I feel like I had a really spoiled creative upbringing that way, and just in terms of like they both were self-employed and they were both doing well enough that it seemed like a viable career for me as a child, um, of which I've sort of learned that it depends a lot on the country you live in and the cost of living, et cetera. But and that's a long journey. But I do feel like um, I feel really lucky, and I know that this isn't the case a lot of the time, that I was very encouraged to pursue art in college if I wanted to. That being said, I didn't go to an art school, and it actually took me a couple years to declare because I was just really curious in a lot of other things, and I've always really loved science. There's elements of math I love, and I was like, give yourself a chance to apply, to like maybe major in something else. And then, of course, come year 3 of college, I was like, just face it. Like what you enjoy doing most is these art classes. Like just, commit. So I finally declared my major and I ended up doing my concentration in printmaking, which is something that I still really love to do. But it's interesting looking back. I was really interested in just doing all monochromatic work, like all black and white woodcuts for the most part. I was really interested in. Um, I think I loved the storytelling nature of them. My work back then was really figurative. I was having a very hard time breaking that and going abstract when I was asked to in class, and um, had a couple critiques like in college, definitely, that uh, I think my professors were worried a little bit that I was too limited in my kind of world, my art world was very like small. And I think part of that was just growing up in Guatemala where figurativism is a huge part of it. There's a lot of magical realism, but there isn't as much abstract art at all. And storytelling is a really big part of Latin America. And a lot of the pieces I grew up around, and including my parents, well, my mother's work in particular was very anecdotal, very like, I don't know, autobiographical and figurative and or representational. And so it's been an interesting journey in kind of finding abstraction, but also I feel like there's always been a trend in my work of this texture element, whether it was in the process of making the work or in the final product. Because I think what I was really drawn to about the printmaking was the carving process actually, and the relief at the end of carving a wood block. For me, that was such a satisfying thing to look at and feel and touch. And it's funny, I was actually never quite as excited about the prints themselves as I was about the relief. And I started to play with bringing texture into my work, um, sort of as an illusion, I guess, with pen and whatnot. Like I was really drawn after after my printmaking stuff. I actually had a little. I played with painting for a while because I didn't have a press at uh, when I moved back home. I didn't have a press I could use. Um, so I used what I could and around me in terms of art supplies, and was able to get some paints and things. So was doing some oil painting, and then that morphed into working with ink and watercolor and doing a lot of line work. And I think part of that was just how do I think I just am so interested in creating this sort of lush richness and this sort of textural feel, that how do you do that with a flat surface? And a lot of that was just line and shadow and that kind of thing. So went from that into bringing thread into my work, and then I actually for a while was doing combining embroidery and paint completely. So that was all I was doing for a while, just because the embroidery started to give me the depth I really loved. And then have slowly worked with more and more found materials and kind of moved from these finer textures into chunkier textures. And it's been really fun to explore, um, not being afraid of like using big things in my work. I think I've always been drawn to that tight, like tight controlled kind of process. And there was a period of when I was working with ink and watercolor, I had a little bit more expressionism in my work, but there was always an element of every piece that was still really over detailed and overworked. And it's been interesting to play with like what that impulse is as I've developed as an artist, in terms of like sometimes the control, which I found is really good for my own mental health. Like just having something, that cathartic process of being able to do this predictable movement over and over again, whatever that is, whether it's, putting down a mark on a paper or like folding a paper or cutting something or tearing it. Um, those things can happen in the process and they're maybe not even seen on the in the final piece, or they are like what you actually celebrate about the piece. So it's been really fun to play with like not needing something to be tiny to feel rich. I've definitely like I think I've sort of wandered into a maximalist world, which I don't know if like I necessarily saw coming, but it's hard. I really love that feeling of like, I don't know, creating a whole kind of filled world that's filled from edge to edge. So playing now probably a little bit with restraint on that front. But yeah, so
Definitely.
kind of a long answer, but I've
No,
been
I love that answer so much because I like while you were saying that, I was like, wow, okay, Maddie and I do that too. Like in so many ways. I'm sure like when if Maddie could talk a little bit about the larger paintings that you're doing and just like the series of the process of underpaintings that you do in order to get to a final product. Because that same process of repetition again and again until you find something that sticks is so
Yeah, so I'm like a notorious paint over something if you don't like it. And yeah, like if you x-rayed my paintings, there's probably like 9 finished paintings underneath the what ends up being the final layer. I kind of lean into that maximalism a little bit too. All of my preparatory work for paintings really come from collage. I'm not a great drawer, like, naturally, and I really don't have, like, a lot of patience for drawing, which kills some of my friends who exclusively do drawing up in New York. They always get on me about that. But collage is kind of like the way that I can experiment with how composition can look. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it starts as like what it's going to end up looking like. It's kind of like a jumping off point for me. And yeah, I think just like looking for those tiny details, especially when you work. Some of my paintings are 8 feet by 8 feet, and things that are details are usually size. And of like the frosting on the cake for me is like when you've got the big components done, like going in and working in those tiny details. Yeah, that helps my mental health too. I think just adding those touches.
Yeah, and I think that kind of dovetails into the question of, for all of you, what does your art mean for you? How do you see the process of making art? Is this something that's cathartic? Is this something that you're just focused on trying to build a career out of? And then also, to that degree, what do you hope the audience gets out of your work? I think as an artist myself, that's one of the things that I struggle with sometimes. Just putting something out and then understanding how the audience is going to perceive it. And if they do perceive it differently than I originally intended, being able to kind of adjust to that. I think, Shri, if you want to hop in there, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, meaning making is such a loaded thing. Like
Mm-hmm.
it's such a um there's a lot of intention I think that goes into the work that I make. And I can say that for all of us. There's a lot of intention that goes into it. Um, but the perception of it is something that I try and let go of. That's a very like big part. The process is a big part for me. The outcome afterwards and how it's received is something that I try to let go of. And it's mostly, I think, because that for me, in initially making art, it was always like a way of kind of processing a lot of different emotions that I've placed into the work. And sometimes, especially with this body of work for the exhibition, I like as for the longest time, I've wanted to work with more like materials from my childhood, kind of like processing a lot of like my upbringing. And some of that is like very much so tied to grief around like estrangement in my family, and just like kind of the way of creating work has been my way of kind of like working through those emotions. And sometimes that maximalist process of like over sewing, of over texturizing, of like placing things that finding different ways to put patterns on top of patterns and creating kind of like jarring, somewhat unsettling compositions is part of my way of working through some of the thoughts in my head. And so when I create work, I think a big part of it is allowing for that meditative process to kind of take hold. And while sometimes like specific pieces will have very, very intimate storylines that are tied to like my experiences, I kind of leave it up to the viewer to find, like I leave little Easter eggs where like there's stories that I want people to see, but then I kind of allow that outcome to, because I mean, I think that like even at the opening when when people had come up to me and were like talking about the work, I was kind of like surprised at what people saw and didn't see. And the people who did come up to me and like ask questions about specific parts of the work and didn't didn't know that some of like the fabrics were like dyed by myself, or didn't know that like the some of the fabrics were things that I'd cut from like clothes from when I was a child, or like um or didn't see repetition in symbols between the works, and just like little things where I felt like I was trying to hide them in there for people to find, so the lucky viewers who did see it kind of understood or maybe felt like there was something. um, but I think that's a big part of like how I make work, is wanting to tell a story without giving all the details away.
Maybe Bree, you could give us your take on it.
Sure. Okay, circling back. So the question was, what is my work for me? What does it do for me? I think for me, I've been actually learning this the last couple years is, and I've touched on this a little bit in the last answer, but um, I have been using my artwork more recently now that I've figured this out, to help me with my anxiety disorder, because I actually realized once I realized I had a moment. So I've been pursuing art professionally since I graduated from college in some sense. And that was at this point 12 years ago. So it's been a little bit of time. And the journey's been interesting because, as I was saying earlier, I've jumped around a lot from medium to medium. I actually really resonated when Maddie said earlier that she was sort of embarrassed if you were to look at like what the full like history, because there are things that are in common. There's a color palette that is definitely you know a line that's linear between all of the work once I got out of the monochromatic stuff, and there are other things that are definitely there, but you could easily say that a lot of different artists made all of these different pieces. And for a while, I think that was because I was really trying to find my voice. And I think I'm also a very curious person. My dad's an architect, and I think there's a part of me that really likes taking things apart and putting them together and seeing if they work. And I love the construction of things and like, yeah, do they work together? Do they not? As Sri was saying, like, how much can you jam into something? How much can you take away? Like, that process is really interesting to me. Um, but I think I was also pretty caught up for quite a while in, and something that was actually, this is something that was tripping me up a bit, is just the self-consciousness of what should I be making? You start to let the outside world get into your head about like, how do you make it as an artist in the world? How do you give people what they want to see so that you can be somebody who is successful or whatever? And I think I had that in my head enough where I had this little voice that was trying to come out and would come out every once in a while. But a lot of the time I was trying to sort of respond to the exterior in a way that was like throwing things at it. Not inauthentically, but just like my best attempt at like, I think this is the conversation the world's having. I'd like to say something about that kind of thing. And it took me the like probably till sort of this last crazy era that we've been in for now almost 3 years of COVID to really be like to really reach a point where I got very frustrated with that sensation and had to like completely say to myself, I truly had to say to myself, um, maybe this isn't like the right career for you. Maybe this is actually too self-conscious of a career for you. And i- if there isn't somebody you're pleasing, like, do you want to make art? Like, is there something about art that is coming out of it, that's coming out of you for you, or is it always for everybody else, right? And so I think it took me kind of feeling that way and trying then to just play to see sort of what moved me, just me, to find the kind of work I made actually for this show. So this show for me is really exciting because it's speaking to a new kind of work is not only that wasn't self-conscious at all in its process. It can be kind of self-conscious to talk about because it's vulnerable, but and because it's a lot of the things I'm processing in it are still sort of complicated for me, like my sense of identity as a person who grew up abroad, who doesn't look, I don't know, who nobody, would think was had like any Latin American influence in them. to carry that around with them all of the time and have it sort of be muted is really an interesting thing. And grappling with that while I've been living in the States for the last 12 years has been weird, because sometimes I'm just kind of like, it doesn't really matter. And then other times it really wells up inside of me. Like, it really matters. This is a huge part of me. I spent 20 years there. And um, so I think this show has been amazing because I've been able to make pieces that are sort of poems to my home, but they're also poems to like little me and like inner me. But they also just speak to this idea of feeling confused about how you belong in a place, which we all experience, right? So I think, yeah, landing in these pieces has been great because they finally feel really authentic, but they also feel exciting. And like, just to answer really quickly what you said about what I hope to evoke in the audience, I mean, I think I finally am understanding that better, and I think that is sort of a sense of wonder that I really love to give people a little thrill, a little adventure. I love to give people curiosity. Um, I love to give people a space to process emotion. So, like, sometimes I think that's why I'm so drawn to textures, just because you can kind of melt into it and like lose yourself a little bit while you're looking at it and process whatever it is you need to. And sometimes you don't even know what that is. But I've been saying that they're you know healing for me to make. There's a relief for me that comes from making these pieces with all of the repetition and order. But then there's also hopefully a sort of emotional processing aspect that comes to the viewer in witnessing it. So
Thank you.
mhm.
Maddie?
Yeah, I was thinking about, especially when I started out kind of early on, this idea of like public versus private, right? Like the work that you make that you don't show to people is private, but does it really belong to you when you put it out into a gallery? Like, does it become someone else's interpretation? Does it kind of belong to the public more when you kind of relinquish control? I think about that a lot with my work, just because, much like Sri and Brielle, it's very intensely personal, and the imagery that I use can kind of border on like the cusp of feeling somewhat violent or somewhat treacherous. Um, and I would say that my work is kind of an admission of like different guilts that I have, and some of my own mental health struggles, anxiety and OCD and things like that. Um, and I think, my work for a while was more concerned about people's interpretation. People would come up to me and say, "Oh, I didn't know that you were female," and making this work. For a while, my work seemed apparently gendered, like more
Okay.
male looking. And so that was kind of not a concern, but just a quandary, and it had a kind of abstract edginess to it early and things like that. And I think as I've gotten older, I've started to care less about maybe what people will perceive from the work. It's more just interesting, like a fact-finding mission to kind of hear that feedback. Um, because I think ultimately, if it's something you want to pursue just personally, I think then you don't have to worry about if you're not intending to exhibit it, I think that you're within your rights to keep it private. But I think once you've made that decision to put it out there, you're relinquishing kind of some of that ownership over your work to a certain extent.
Now, on the actual pieces themselves, I had picked out a few that I had found interesting. I don't know if you guys want to go through and talk about the pieces that I had picked out, or
Yeah, sure, let's do it.
all right. So we'll start with you, Maddie, since we got you unmuted. So just want to double check that I have the right ones here, because I think I have underneath and hellos. Those are
Okay.
both listed under you. Is that correct?
Yeah, you might have to there were so many. You might have to refresh me. What I know what underneath looks like, but I need to remember what hello looks like.
So Hellos is the one where it's like the older man, looks like an older man, and the hat is kind of
Oh yeah. Okay.
bowing to a
Yeah.
small girl.
Hmm.
And then the underneath is the purple and kind of the, it's like an arm peeking
Hmm.
out of underneath the
Yeah, like
staircase.
underneath the staircase.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I think when I'm collaging, there's rarely a time where I am intending to do anything in particular. A lot of times, and this is going to sound like a really boring answer, but a lot of times I look at light source as a way to combine materials together. So if there's an image of something, let's just say a person, and it's in a like mid-afternoon light in an image in a magazine, and I see something interesting that's like a textural landscape or outdoor landscape and it has similar lighting. I like the ability to kind of seamlessly integrate things together to create that kind of surreal interaction where could it possibly be that this person who's dressed like this or is behaving like this or looks like they're about to do this is in a space that maybe feels uncomfortable or just at odds with whatever I'm trying to represent or the figure I'm trying to represent. And so with this show, it was particularly challenging because I selected a book that was in black and white, which I wanted to do to kind of challenge myself, but also because I knew that Sri and Brielle were going to use really like high saturated, colors in the books that they selected. Um, and using honestly, Brielle's book was challenging for me just because it was more abstracted, and so trying to integrate something from each book, I I tried to kind of make the things that were abstracted more literal. And so, with things like hello, like I used different textures, I think in like different garments and things as the background or like as sometimes they were as shadows on the ground or as like physical objects in the sky. um, so it was a departure for me from what I normally do to kind of stretch myself to try to imagine the things that were more abstracted as more of subject matter.
So to get a little more clarity on the light source, is that something that you do? The light sources at odds with each other, or do you try to match them up?
I like them to work together. I like it to feel like it's the same space, whether that's outside or inside. I have done like collage workshops and residencies and things where I work with other or I'm working alongside other collage artists who use like vintage materials more, and I think there's a big kind of slice in the collage world of people that use more vintage based papers and a new direction of people that are using more kind of modern paper types, which are not as they're not as nice to use. They're flimsier because it's like the economy of printing and things like that. It's just completely different than it was back then. But you get a completely different look when you're using things that are done with modern photography and these different kind of paper types. And so I just when I first started doing collage, which was recently, it was right when the pandemic started and we couldn't get into our studios because our building had shut down. And so the things that I had around me were like these terrible, just bad, like Talbot's catalogs, like of I don't even know why I was getting those because like I wear black all the time, but I was getting like these bad like Vera Bradley catalogs and things and like restoration hardware of like furniture I could never afford. And I was like, okay, well, this is what I've got because I can't work on my giant paintings in my house. And so I started grabbing all of these very kind of modern like catalogs and magazines. Like I was getting stuff from when my grandmother lived here, like NRA magazines. Like I was getting just like a ton of different stuff. But in some ways it was easier because they weren't vintage papers and they were more modern shots to kind of blend different elements from these different magazines more seamlessly. And so, um, like some collage artists kind of turn their nose to that idea of using like modern papers and things, but I kind of find that you can get something really striking, and it looks like a photograph if you can cut it the right way and place it the right way, which is something I think it looks less kind of, you know, cut and paste on in that kind of like derivative sense, if that makes sense.
Thank you. And then Shri, the ones that I had identified for you were nightlife and then the 6 degrees of separation. If you could speak to those.
Oh yeah, I just pulled them up so that I could be like, wait a second.
Yeah, makes sense.
I do actually remember. Yeah, I remember these. Yeah, I'm so glad you pulled up nightlife because that's actually one of my favorite collages.
Okay.
I actually think that's one of Brielle's favorite collages. It's the one with the weaving in the background. Um, yeah, I had an awesome time making collages for this show. And it's something that I have actually it sounds embarrassing to be like I've never actually made like collage with representational things pulled from magazines because I always felt like when I did it when I was a kid or I always made like the weirdest things like it would be like placing shapes that didn't belong together next to each other and I never really could figure out how to create narrative or like do what Maddie's talking about, which is like creating an intentional story where like you can't tell whether this was actually already happening, like whether this image already existed in space and time. And so my approach to collage is this, it has that bent to it, which is very this is obviously not happening. This is obviously not real. And it's obviously like a dream. It's always this very like playing with these like the what's mystical and but taking like everyday reality and making it kind of dreamlike. And so a lot of the collages that I have are very this magical realism style of like pooling very sourced imagery where someone is doing something and putting it out of context. So this woman standing, this beautifully dressed woman, like fully made up in nightlife, is standing like what is in like a city square, like waiting for somebody outside of a marketplace, I think. And then being like making it like she's after like on a long night after like a discotheque kind of thing. And this like surreal, like this kind of like she's hiding in the bushes doing something secretive and like out and like it's fun to play I think with collage because it allows me this opportunity to like rather than because I'm while I find myself to be pretty imaginative, my imagination is very abstract and I'm not immediately able to conjure figurative or representational spaces for myself when it comes to art. More easily, I'm able to place colors and shapes together in lines, but I don't immediately conjure full imagery. And so using collage as a vehicle for that, I find it really fascinating to be able to find a subject or a specific one specific image that I really love, and then creating a story around that. And so, especially like with both of those, like nightlife and the 6 degrees of separation, was like seeing maybe one person in a crowd or the shapes that are created and pulling them out, and then kind of like taking it from there. So with 6 degrees of separation, I actually cut out people from a crowd who were standing, and then I flipped the page over and I realized it looked way cooler on the back than it did, even though I spent all this time cutting people out. I realized that it looked way cooler on the back. And just felt this idea that like my goal was to talk about these places of like being crowded and then not noticing a single person, but then still feeling connected to being a part of being part of like one voice in a large crowd kind of feeling. And I realized that regardless of the context of whether it was people that you could recognize or not, the flipped over version of just like random people on a street told the same story. And so that's kind of how I feel like I play with collage in my work, and especially with the larger tapestry works that I create from the collages. It's a lot of what can I add and what can I take away to like still tell the same story that I'm trying to tell.
Yeah, and I remember when we met and you were telling me we were looking at the books together, and I had seen some of the ways that you had identified, integrated the sewing into it, and then also the cutout pieces where there were kind of like swatches of fabric layered in to add some dynamics to it. I really enjoyed that.
Yeah, thank you. Um, the book was a hell of a lot of fun to create. That was actually like probably it's probably my favorite artifact that's come out of the show. Like even though I really do love all of the works that I made for the show, I think the book is the one thing that I feel like I covet a little bit where I'm like, it better come back safe because I really want it so badly.
It's
Um,
funny that
because I think it was like the part where you realize that all of the work that you've created was inspired by this one thing. And so I didn't realize how much it meant to me until I was coming back in and like adding these special little details for people to see, and realizing that not only that I was kind of doing the special details for me and not for other people, and that changed my relationship with the book itself.
it's funny that you mentioned that because when I first picked it up, I was like, "Is this for sale too?"
No.
All right, and then Brielle, the ones that I identified for you was pyramids, and then let the light of your glowing heart. The kind of it reminds me of when I was younger. I used to play at different games where you could you just had four directions. You could kind of control where your avatar thing was going. I really got lost in both of those pieces. If you could describe a little bit of the process that goes into that, how you came about, what you see in those pieces, it'd be interesting to get your insight on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I just am so excited that you got lost in them because that's the whole point. But yeah, no, really quickly, I just wanted to answer what Sri was saying too about the book. I feel like the book feels like a little jewel because it is for us, and it's sort of our little journal. It's almost like our little journal of creating this show together in a way where it's like I think I'll always just have that on my bookshelf, and I can potentially take it off and show it to people. But otherwise, it just looks like this unassuming book, which is just crazy because it's packed with all of this cool stuff. So it's such a cool little way to trap this experience and everything that has kind of gone into this show into um, a little thing that you can actually just put on a shelf. Art books are amazing. It kind of made me appreciate them. I mean, I always have, but I've never tried to make one. So it was really cool that way. But to speak to the pieces, so the pyramid piece is called Sacred Self Surfacing. And it's funny. So the three sort of pieces I made for the show, the home piece, the other piece you referred to is 12 separate pieces that are all for sale individually, but they definitely come together to create one, what feels like one large piece and was intended as one sort of ongoing piece. Um, so I almost feel like I like contributed three pieces to the show, which feels like it isn't much. But then when you actually take apart obviously there, two of them are largish, and the third has all these little parts, and it was really wild to. Um, I'll speak to the pyramid piece first, but that piece for me was a sort of ode to the process of like letting your It's I guess it's a pretty simple concept. I think we all go through this at some point, but it's that process of like letting your inner self come out and rise above what you might have been doing to please people or whatever. So it's interesting because in that piece, I was pulled toward this symmetry that I never work in. I very rarely make symmetrical work. I've fallen into making almost exclusively abstract work, even though I really love drawing and I love drawing from life and I love representational work, but for whatever reason, I think similarly to Sri, like my brain, where my imagination goes is abstract. And I love the abstraction and the texture for like what it can do on its own. And just sort of creating this totally separate world that we haven't seen. So I think like with that piece, I folded those pyramids. So I think there are 200, sorry, 2,193 pyramids in that piece.
That's a lot.
Which this is gonna make everybody feel sorry for me, but it was totally okay. I like hand cut and hand folded and stuck all of those, and there are 9 different heights of pyramids in the piece. And I've been playing more recently with how do I create movement on a surface um, by playing with the height of the shapes I'm working with and creating these sort of undulating uh, surfaces. What's interesting is that this piece, because of the way that I used the mounds in the piece to sort of signify the spaces where the like inner self or the sacred self was coming to the surface, they are totally correlated with the color in the piece in a way that I don't usually do. So like, or that isn't usually how I'm drawn. So this is all really abstract and sometimes I'm not great at talking about this. I'm sorry. But I'm going to try to make sense. Um Usually when if you were to look at the piece like lying on its back, it would look sort of like a topographical map, right? And the parts that are the hills are currently where all of the textile colors are concentrated. And so it's interesting when you look at it, some of the movement's actually lost because it's dominated by the color. So like you can't see the depth of the piece unless you really stand on the side and look at it as you move around it, in a way that's different than a lot of the time. I don't necessarily match up the color and the height of the pyramids. There's more of a gradual thing happening so that the color and the height are or the movement of the paper is actually two different elements at play. But this time they're all together. And I think that the reason that I was drawn to making something so symmetrical is because the piece feels sort of like a mandala of some kind, or there's something that does feel, um, I don't know. I wanted to celebrate the sacredness of sort of what it is to be vulnerable and to actually show your authentic self. Um, and there's something really, I don't know, there's something that humans have always expressed in almost like a symmetrical way, or a geometrical way about the things we find sacred. And it was really natural that that happened. I don't know, I didn't necessarily plan on it. And then it ended up almost looking like a prayer rug or something. My mom was like, this piece looks like a textile. And I didn't have that intention when I went into it, but it just ended up sort of blooming in this way that ended up looking um, more traditionally, almost like reverential in a way that I didn't even particularly expect, but it all just came together really beautifully, to get the message across, I think.
Yeah,
So that was really exciting.
I took it in from a
And
lot of angles.
yeah, I
I was
know.
trying to get it from the bottom and the sides and everything like that. And then I sat
I'm
on his
sorry, I
seat
got
on.
kind of nerdy with the pyramid heights. This is my head. This is how.
No, I mean that's what art is, right? You're finding ways to put together the amalgamation of influences and ideas that you have in your head.
Yeah.
And I think you've done a pretty good job describing that one. It was,
Thank you.
I mean, it was fairly intense, right? I mean, the piece is so large. There's a lot to engage with it on. I mean, you could stand in front of it for a minute and um, kind of get lost in it, and then 20 minutes later, you're like, oh man, there's so many things in this. Um, but yeah, I really
Yeah,
appreciate that one.
there's a lot to look at, and I like that these pieces change so much with light, and there's just a lot of ways to bring them to life. Yeah. The home piece, that's the 12 series, it's called Let the Light of Your Glowing Heart Lead You Home. And the idea behind that was sort of a similar thing. Like if you were to sort of consider like your your true self, but by that I just mean, I I know that that's a thing that changes, but like if you were to consider the self that you sort of identify with and the self that you feel tenderly toward, the things that you kind of have carried with you since childhood that you feel positively about, that you want to continue to cultivate in your life. The idea behind this piece was sort of the process of refinding those things. So, like at the beginning of this piece, um, there are these splashes of color amongst this path that you kind of visually follow. And for the first four pieces, um, most of the path is black and white. And there are just these little splashes of color that for me meant this sort of spark of like remembering who you are in the midst of this maybe new sort of status quo normal that you've fallen into, like that morning when you wake up and you're like, why don't I read anymore, or you're like, why haven't I done this thing that I used to love to do in such a long time? And that black and white world being kind of this world you've just sort of been chugging through, and then these little blurbs of color being these thoughts of like, hey, I used to love to do this, like I want to return to doing that. And over the course of the path in the 12 pieces, it shifts for the second set of four into being very 50-50. And at the end of the eighth piece, so sort of two-thirds of the way through, you actually see the light of the golden heart. Basically, it's like a very symmetrical piece. It's the only symmetrical piece in the whole um, series, and it's just this glowing little orb that turns into the black and white, that moves into the black and white. And that's sort of the recognition of, oh man, like I'm on my way, right? This is a thing that's happening. There's a momentum here. And then the final four pieces are you sort of returning home being this person that you've kind of rekindled. You've rekindled the love affair sort of with yourself, is kind of how I've um, thought about it. And I don't know. I mean, I think that's also a process that a lot of us go through at one point or another, and sometimes multiple times in your life, right? Or like even in a few months, you go through that whole process. So I think a lot of the things we love about ourselves, we have to continue to remind ourselves to cultivate. And that's something that has always fascinated me a little bit, but is also like such an exciting challenge in a way. So that's what that piece is about.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that because I'm personally on a similar journey. And when I talked to the February artist, they had also mentioned recapturing something from their youth. I think, like you had mentioned earlier in the talk, the circumstances of COVID, the stretching of time, it feels like, has given us all a lot of space to like look at ourselves, reevaluate, where we stand and how we feel about our place in the world. And I can definitely identify with all the tucking things away, to pay the bills, to make sure that responsibilities are taken care of, and then kind of losing your lightheartedness.
Mhm.
But trying to refine that's definitely a journey that I've been on myself. And that's how I ended up doing the artist talks. It actually culminated from me purchasing a piece from an artist from one of the previous exhibitions and getting a chance to talk to them. And they had done a found piece, like Shri was talking about earlier. She had a dress from when she was younger and turned it into something else that another person identified with me and purchased. So it's a cool little way to keep, everybody flowing, keep the ideas, keep everybody connected.
So cool.
So being sensitive to time, I'd like to kind of wrap it up there, and I'll give each of you an opportunity to say where we can find you on your social media channels and any shows that you're going to be in coming up next that you would like to talk about. So I think we'll start with Tree, if you want to close it out for us.
So you can find me at my website is www.srikodakalla.com. And my Instagram is not my name, so you will not be able to find me if you look up my name. There's so many other Sris out there, but not me. my Instagram is at dystopian_conditionals. And I don't have any current like art projects or art exhibition plans. I've actually been purposefully working up to this show to take a pause, and a pause in a very intentional way where I really like this show kind of brought out a lot of excitement toward very large projects that I really want to pursue in terms of creating larger tapestry works that are going to require months of planning and months of making. And so part of me is very, very excited to be able to just like dedicate time toward the practice of making work over the course of the next like 6 to 8 months, and kind of take it from there. Yeah.
Well, we look forward to see what you come up with. Maddie, if you'd like to give us your details.
Yeah, so this will be the last show I do until 2023, where I'll be showing large-scale paintings based off of collages that I've created. I'm kind of about to go dark on social media because I usually have to take like 6 to 9 months off of looking at things on Instagram. I find that you can be really influenced by what you're kind of scrolling through, and I find that I do less of that comparison game when I just kind of focus on what I need to get done. But my Instagram handle is at MERhondeau, which is my maiden name. So you can find me that way. And if you just look up my name, I'll pop up.
And if people are interested in purchasing things from you, that's where they can get a hold of you as well.
Yeah, I don't really have the large paintings. I haven't put prices on. They're not done yet. If people want to buy stuff from this show, they can. They can reach me from my website, which is mrhondeau.com, if they wanted to talk shop. But I usually only put things out maybe a couple times a year, things for sale. I just when I put things out for sale, I like them to be affordable. I like to kind of cherry pick the things that I put out.
That makes sense. And Brie?
I am on Instagram under my name, so at Brielle DuFlon. And that's my art page. And then let's see, my website is brielleduflon.com. So same, just my full name. And then I'm also taking a little break. We're not sorry guys, you can't see our shows anywhere soon. But yeah, I'm also taking a little break, sort of rearranging some little life and family things, and am going to kind of reassess some stuff. But I'm super excited to continue in this vein. So hoping that the work, I'm actually just going to stick with paper for a while. So if people like what they're seeing here, I hope they keep in touch and like stick around because this is going to keep happening. Yeah, and I just want to say, last little message is just that I really loved working with these two. We've been friends for a while, and this is our first show together, and it's really been such a cool thing to work with these ladies. I've admired their work for a long time. So,
And thanks to everyone for taking some time out and joining me today and walking us through your show.
thank you, Justin.
Thank you so much, Justin.
Thank you, 934 Gallery.
You're so welcome. We're glad to have you guys.